Hey, Dad.
Yeah. Hey!
I mentioned in a previous video on this trip I've been able to check out all of my older phones because as I upgrade or downgrade, my previous generation iPhones have found their way into other family members' pockets. And, you know, we kind of talked about my mom's 13 Pro Max somewhat recently, and y'all probably know how I feel about the iPhone 12 mini, which my sister is currently using, but this is one that I thought was worth revisiting, the 11 Pro Max, because the more I was thinking back at this generation iPhone, which you can find, by the way, for like sub $400 on eBay refurbished and probably sub $300 on Marketplace. This was an interesting generation in my opinion because this is really when Apple started to go on the offense. This generation was when Apple started compromising on some of their own exclusive features that they worked really hard on in order to beat out or match the competition in terms of specs and features. So that's why I kind of look at the 11 Pro Max as going on the offense. You know, Apple had their own way of doing things with the iPhone 10. This is the phone I'm currently rocking. It's kind of one of the first phones to do the true depth camera system for Face ID, and sure, other phones had OLED, but Apple went very drastic when it comes to the rounded display corners, and they chose a much smaller screen size than their competitors did, as well as being the only company to get a same size bezel all the way around the edges, not having a chin like the Galaxy S8 did that same year. And sure, Apple diversified on this form factor the following year with the XS and XS Max, but this one made some controversial ones that some die-hard Apple sheep are still, to this day, you know who you are, pretty upset by, like the removal of 3D Touch, which was first demoed with the iPhone XR, which only had haptic touch, but it was a lot cheaper. It was a lower-end iPhone, so people kind of excused it, but this was the first time Apple was removing such a streamlined feature that was almost like the headline perk of the iPhone 6S, other than the 4K camera in the A9 chip. Basically, 3D Touch was one of the biggest reasons to opt for an iPhone 6S back when it came out, but this was straight up saying, no, you know what, you don't need 3D Touch. But we know from the teardowns and the extra display layers that were required for 3D Touch to work, you were sacrificing quite a bit on battery. So the 11 Pro Max was kind of a turning point in the iPhone trajectory, in my opinion, because this is when they decided, okay, you know what, not that many people are using 3D Touch. Even though we have some diehards that really love it, we're going to take the L on 3D Touch, except that not very many people are using it, but a ton more people want better battery life. And personally, I cannot recall ever a time in Apple's history where the battery life improved as drastically as it did with the 11 Pro Max. You know, when they first unveiled it, Apple was like, on the 11 Pro Max, your battery life will last 5 hours longer. And I was like, doing what? What are you talking about? There's no way that Apple actually means like 5 hours more of screen time or something, but little did I realize, oh my god, they weren't kidding. Switching from the XS Max to the 11 Pro Max, I definitely noticed like basically twice the battery life that I got before. And yeah, I was sad that we missed out on 3D Touch. It was cool tech for the time we had it, and thankfully I'm still kind of getting to enjoy it with the iPhone 10 in my pocket, but I totally understand the compromise of going with the better battery life that is just more universally appreciated. And sadly, as much as I love 3D Touch, most of its advantages can be replaced by a long press, and that's what Apple calls haptic touch. But it wasn't just battery life and display changes like that, it was also this back design. This is when Apple decided, hey, we're not going to stick around with this stoplight camera bump anymore, and they've been hearing about people complain about all of the fingerprints on the back, and Apple even made a really daring change that we often forget about and take for granted with the 11 Pro Max. They fundamentally changed the layout on the back to no longer say the word iPhone. This is something many people out there assumed Steve Jobs maybe wouldn't have been okay with, you know? They were so stingent about always having just that little lettering on the back, whether it's iPad, whether it's iPhone, or even MacBook is underneath our MacBooks, or on older MacBook designs, it's even on the display lid. But this was the one when Apple started realizing, oh, wait a second, there's no limit to how big we can get our camera bumps. You know, the camera bump grew on the iPhone 6 to the 7 and of course the 10, but to me, this was really Apple's Apple's starting to admit we don't care how much space it takes up on the back, because all of us thought the stoplight camera bump design would just continue down the phone. That's what we actually had a ton of renders of, was just 3 lenses going down. But Apple realized that they could fit better sensors and have closer to equal distance between the 3 lenses in order to maximize photography and videography, which many have said that before the iPhone 11 came out, Android had the win over. They had the better telephoto lenses, and they definitely were sporting all of the ultra-wide capabilities, which the iPhone didn't have until this generation. So Apple was willing to change what the fundamental look of the iPhone was, with the name at the bottom and the logo on the top, for the sake of, we need to catch up to our competitors. We need to have better cameras. We need to have more lenses, and we need to have less fingerprints on the back. But by far the biggest, I think, shift in direction was that abandonment of 3D touch. I honestly can't think of another feature that Apple prided themselves so strongly on that they then turn around to remove in favor of just something as basic as better battery life. But to me, the iPhone 11, while not inherently innovative, and frankly, this took a lot of things that other Android phones had first, this is evidence that you don't necessarily need innovation in order to make a great product. Sometimes when tech has matured the way it has with smartphones, all you want is just something that works, something that's reliable. It doesn't need to do anything out of the ordinary, like fold in half or have solar charging or something crazy like that. No, as long as you can unlock it reliably with your face, you've got a fast processor and years of software support, which my dad is still dailying this phone, and the responsiveness, as I've been playing around with it here, is still very good. The display is still incredibly rich, and also, because I'm so used to my iPhone 10, this feels gargantuan now. It's like massive. But the reason I think so many people out there, and I've seen it in my comments and live streams all the time, are still rocking the 11 Pro Max is because it just focused on taking what Apple is known for, reliable software and decent hardware, but then just pushing it more towards the offensive. Okay, let's accept that not everybody's in love with 3D touch, or that not everybody cares about the iPhone branding being in a very specific place, or the Apple logo being in a very specific place. No, we're going to detract from our roots a little bit to make something that's reliable and consistent and just overall likable, that's gonna last a real long time. And that's why I think you see so many of these dang 11 Pro Maxes everywhere, because they just age so insanely well. My dad still is using the same battery that I originally had with this 11 Pro Max all those years ago, and it's still, even in 2023, sitting at 83%, as in it's still working at peak performance capability. And because the battery life was so long to begin with, it still gets him through the day without an issue. So probably the only hardware on this thing that's not going to age as gracefully is the fact that it doesn't have 5G, but that's on the fault of the carriers down throttling the 4G speeds. I have tested smartphones with 4G in the exact same places over the years and seen noticeable throttling, so I'm fairly convinced that the carriers are over prioritizing 5G and deprioritizing 4G. But as long as so many of us are working from home these days anyway, Wi-Fi is good enough. And I also want to applaud the 11 Pro Max for basically being the most comfortable max-sized iPhone out there, you know? The newer iPhones that have gotten bigger than this all have those real sharp edges that kind of cut into your hands a lot more. This has that matte frosty finish on the back, which I love. Still has the rounded chassis, which sits very elegantly and gently in my hands. Has that all-day battery life, and not to mention, this was one of the first iPhones they ever called Pro. And just in case you forgot it, this is still to this day the only iPhone generation to ship with a 20-watt fast charger. Just 1 year after switching to fast charging, they actually defaulted to having no charge brick at all. But including that fast charger, I think is just another example of how the 11 Pro Max went on the offense. It was like, okay, all of the Android guys are having fast chargers, then fine, we're gonna ship a fast charger, and we're gonna have an ultra-wide lens, we're gonna have the better water resistance, and we're gonna have the better battery life. And some of you may have appreciated that generation, and some of you may be annoyed by the stovetop camera, or maybe annoyed by the frosted glass or the lack of 3D touch, but I think the sales kind of speak for themselves, and my estimation is that my dad is going to continue using this phone for probably many years to come, because there's newer generations of iPhone, but what are they doing that much better?
Hey Dad, how do you like your phone?
It's fine. Hey, you got a bunch of underwear downstairs.
So how many of you out there are still rocking your 11 Pro Maxes? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.